Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. All right, well, welcome back to this week's episode. Today, we're going to discuss a topic that actually has been requested a number of times over the last few months. And interestingly, it's the topic of profanity, profanity within the church and the life of just an individual Christian. So let me just go ahead at the top of this podcast to go ahead and advise our listeners that it is quite possible, if not probable, that some words or expressions that might be considered profane will come up today. I don't know what Jim's going to say, but I just feel like on the front end, I should probably give that disclaimer. So if you're used to listening to this podcast with your young children around, I would say either grab some headphones or maybe just wait until a better time when they're not around to listen to this one. But okay, so back to the topic though. So several of our listeners have noted just a growing trend in evangelical churches and in the individual lives of Christians in general that seems to be more lenient toward cursing and name calling and sarcastic jabs and insults, and then on it goes. I remember in his Mars Hill days, Mark Driscoll was known as the cussing pastor because of his occasional use of curse words or strong language in sermons and seminars. And then was it Thaddeus Matthews, a pastor in Tennessee? He wrote a book called The Cussing Pastor, identifying himself as such. Some Christians find the use of profanity completely acceptable at times when it's an expression of passion or conviction, and others find it completely unbiblical regardless of the context. Beyond that, not everyone even agrees on what actually constitutes profanity. So I think we're going to have a good bit to talk about today. But let's start off by just defining the word profanity. What does that even mean nowadays, and what follows under its umbrella?
Yeah. Well, let's start off with the word profane before we get to profanity. The word profane has a Latin base of two words, pro and fanus. Pro, out of, fanus, temple. So it's talking about those things which are outside of the temple, meaning the secular. So the word itself is actually tied to religion or faith or those things. We talk about the phrase the sacred and the profane, for example. In that sense, it's everything that is related to that which is not sacred, the secular. It can also refer to a person or behavior that is not respectful of things that are religious or sacred, such as saying that somebody profaned something. But the word profanity has to do with language, specifically using blasphemous or obscene language. Most people would equate that just swearing, cussing. And every culture has its own swear words or dirty words or words that you get your mouth rinsed out with soap over when you're little. Usually they fall into three categories across all cultures. The first is abusive swearing. Abusive swearing is intended to offend. It's intended to intimidate. It's intended to cause someone emotional or psychological harm. So that's why we talk about cussing someone out. So it's directed in an aggressive way towards someone. So you might say something like, to somebody, "What the hell are you doing?" kind of thing, and it's aggressive in its nature. The second is cathartic swearing. When something is cathartic or provides a catharsis, then it's because it provided psychological relief, some type of outlet, some type of release through the expression of strong emotions. So you hit your thumb with a hammer, or you drop something and it breaks, and you let out a swear word like, damn it, or something like that. And when that happens. The third type is technically known as dysphomistic swearing, which is used by a speaker who is making it clear they think negatively of something, negatively of a subject matter, and suggest that the listener should do the same. So you might refer to or describe someone using coarse or profane language, essentially calling them a name, son of a bitch or ass or something like that. Now, with the word itself, profanity, rooted in the word profane, and that meaning which is secular instead of sacred, it shouldn't be surprising that an awful lot of our English, at least, swear words coming from the Christian West and are rooted in reaction to the Christian faith or some type of distortion of the Christian faith or taking from the Christian faith out of the temple and using them in a way that is secular. So, but they're yet robust Christian words, and that would be damn, that would be hell, that would be God, that would be saying and then joining them, like in joining God and damn or something like that. Even the English use of the word, one of the most common swear words that people in America puzzle over is the word bloody. And they don't realize that is a swear word over there. That is not a mild term. That is something that's fairly intense. It's a swear word tied to the Christian faith. Its history is a little muddied, but there's pretty good stream of evidence saying that its origin is that it's essentially like saying God's blood, which was very much in medieval terms, saying by God's blood or God's blood as a swear word, but it usually refers to his passion or the Eucharist. So the word bloody got to be used in a swear word that way. Most other swear words are sexual in nature, crude depictions of sexual acts or biological acts, which again, though, is still profane because it's the sanctity of the sexual part meant to be honored and kept holy within marriage that is being debased.
Now, the dominant viewpoint within Christian tradition, at least, is that profanity has no place within the church or the life of a believer. What is that sentiment based on?
Alexis, I'm not sure I would quite put it that way.
Okay.
Yes, in the mainstream life of American Christian faith, you don't hear a lot of swearing. And if you did, it wouldn't be something that would be, widely celebrated. But I think it's more accurate to say that what the position of the Christian faith is that the taking of the Lord's name in vain has no place in the life of the church of a believer. That's what's rock solid. That's what's most front and center. Or the misuse of God's name through profanity. Really, any use of God's name that is outside of its proper context. Taking something sacred and using it in a way that is not sacred. This is the most common understanding of what the third of the Ten Commandments is trying to get across. And it's serious. One reason is because of what it says about you, what it says about the person who's voicing God's name in that particular way. Let's face it, certain statements are just dead giveaways of people. They're just dead giveaways. If you overhear somebody saying something about, one of the problems investing in penny stocks is that the buy-sell spread can be as high as 90%. You probably would know you're hearing someone in the stock market or a financial planner or investment counselor. If you heard someone talking about downloadable executable files and associated DLLs or something like that, or using statically linked or dynamically linked load modules, you probably think, okay, I think I'm around a computer programmer. I'm pretty sure I am. If you hear someone say she's dilated 8 centimeters and we've got the epidural in place, you are probably hearing a labor delivery nurse or an OBGYN. So when you hear someone say, oh my God, or something like that, and then they're excited and upset or shocked or surprised, or they join the words God and damn when they are angry, or they exhale Jesus or Jesus Christ when they are angry, what can you assume about that person? You can't draw conclusions about vocation, race, gender, or income, but you can tell a lot about their heart. Jesus said very clearly, whatever is in your heart is what overflows in your speech. So that's serious. It may be because they are uninformed. It may be because they're uncontrolled or just outside of any kind of a relationship with God. But the bottom line is still a failure to take God seriously, and which means a heart that's far from him. So I think that that's what's universally understood about what is considered profane in the Bible. And I would put that in a very different category than I would hitting your thumb and saying, that hurt like hell or something like that. Or using God's name almost as a prayer or reflection. Something bad happens and, you'll hear the most devout of Christians say, oh, dear God, I'm so, hearing about a death or someone hurt in an accident or, used to be among a lot of elderly Christian grandmothers, sweet Jesus, with something like that. And that obviously was not profane or misusing God's name at all, more of a whispered prayer.
Well, I mentioned that some of the listeners who wrote in about this felt like that it's this tolerance of profanity has become, I guess, more widespread or more apparent now. And so I'm just interested about your own observations and experience within the decades of ministry work that you've been involved in? Do you really feel like churches are becoming more tolerant of the use of profanity, or is it just a few outliers here and there who are, making the news or skewing our perspective?
I think there is a loosening of sorts when it comes to language, particularly with some of what might be considered garden variety, tamer words like damn and hell. A phrase like, as I just mentioned, it hurt like hell isn't something particularly shocking or alarming. In recent years, even the word, shit has become rather mainstream. Let's say you get a group of Christian guys together and they truly love Jesus and they love interacting with each other. I don't think it would be completely off the wall for one of them to use a word now and then, in that context. Maybe not the F-bomb, but but something among trusted friends in a way that would not be seen as violating their faith. I've had men share with me confidentially as they searched for words that something hurt like hell, or that they felt like a piece of shit for something that they did to their wife, or they had someone else say to them, John, what the hell were you thinking, friend, when you did that? And, I personally am not shocked or offended by that kind of language or use of it. They were just trying to find the best way to express themselves. It wasn't abusive. Go back to our types. It wasn't simply to be cathartic. It wasn't meant to characterize someone else. It wasn't sexually in nature. It was descriptive language in the context of a trusted relationship where they were trying to describe a feeling or an action. I think there's a growing sense of freedom. Whether people think that's right or wrong, I think there's a growing sense of freedom to do that. Personally, when it's done that way, and when it's a personal, kind of private, in close quarters where trust is built and you have confidence in each other's character, I think there's a little bit of a freer use of descriptive words that seem to fit that they wouldn't say more loudly or commonly in public. I don't have a particular problem with that, with all of those contexts and qualifiers. But in regard to using profanity along the lines I mentioned earlier, which was to be abusive, or as a way of demeaning someone else, or using sexually suggestive language, there's really not, I don't sense a growing tolerance to that, and good. There shouldn't be. We can talk about this more later, but even in the context of a sermon, it's rare. It should be rare, though I might get into where it might be appropriate, and I may even give some examples that might shock some people because they're actually biblical ones, but let's see if we get there.
Okay. Well, first, I did notice just in some of the research that I was doing in preparation for this that it is interesting to listen to some of the rhetoric in favor of the use of profanity. And this is like more broad than just cuss words in particular, but I've just noticed that a little bit of the language, I think, has shifted. Instead of saying that things are offensive, you might hear like, oh, it's off color. Or, as mentioned earlier, like cussing can be seen as an expression of passion or righteous anger, or a derogatory comment as, it's just a harmless joke, or a foul comment as a slip of the tongue. Do you take these comments as simply signs that our barometer for the profane is different now than what it used to be?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that there has been a coarsening in our culture in relation to language, and the use of profanity, even the worst of it, has gone mainstream. For example, just look at films. Think about films. It's a way of taking a quick cultural pulse. Dropping an F-bomb used to guarantee an R rating for a movie. Absolute guarantee, just not even thinking about it. Today, you can hear the F-bomb word, the F word, in PG-13 movies. For example, the movie The Batman has a lot of profane language in it, including the use of the words shit, bitch, and asshole. It also had one use of the F word. It was PG-13. You can even put the word mother in front of the F word, and as long as it's not vocalized too many times, you can still walk away with a PG-13. There have been studies on this. In fact, you can have profanity, you can have depictions of violence and brief nudity in a film, and it not even go above PG. What happens culturally with something like profanity is that the more you're exposed to it, the more it is heard, the less it has a shock value. And it doesn't seem to be the big, terrible thing that it used to be. I came across a really interesting article about this in Psychology Today recently that we'll link to in the show notes on the rise in swearing. in our culture, and particularly the evolution of the F word. And it really was an interesting read. A word I will not verbalize in this podcast. I still have a very hard time with it. It is a particular swear word that I loathe. But let me just walk you through the gist of the article and the research it was reporting on. Recent research suggests that some of our taboo words are becoming just simply less taboo, and that swearing in public has just become part of a new normal. While we don't have any new data on swearing in private conversations versus earlier eras, profanity in public forums, that's definitely something we're able to study and track. For example, research on the appearance of, and again, for example, you're whenever I say stuff like this, Alexis, I don't mean it condescending when I say you're way too young to remember this. But George Carlin was a comedian who had a very famous monologue called 7 Words You Can Never Say on TV, which he then promptly said. And it really was funny. It was really funny. Carlin was a fantastic, talented comedian. But they actually did research on the 7 words that George Carlin brought up, and they have become 29 times more common in today's literature than they were in the 1950s. This suggests that something has changed over the decades that has made such language a lot less offensive, at least to a significant portion of the population. And what is especially striking is how omnipresent even the most offensive bad words have become, such as the rise of the F word in everyday conversation. A word that is taking sexual intercourse and giving it this very coarse representation and using that in common speech. A survey of tweets was conducted by the word search tool WordTips that found that the F word is now America's most commonly tweeted curse word. So it dominates social media. It's also the most commonly used British swear word, having surpassed bloody in the last several decades. In that study, the F word was particularly favored by those who were younger speakers. This is not surprising, given that younger speakers, particularly teenagers and those in their 20s, tend to be the ones who use the most profanity overall. But that brings us to the question of what has changed over the years to make the F word increasingly acceptable where once it was deemed offensive. And a main finding was that the F word branched out of being a crude way of referring to a sexual act and became an idiomatic phrase. And let me tell you what I mean. As in the phrase, what the F? Or, for F's sake. That has increased threefold in recent years. The F word has just undergone this process that linguists refer to as delexification. Or an expansion of a word's definition and function, actually more function, ultimately resulting in a decay of its original meaning. In other words, a decrease in the use of a word's literal meaning coupled with an increase of more figurative use weakens its meaning over time. Hence, it goes mainstream and it's used all over the place and nobody's blushing. For instance, when someone says, it's effing hot in here, it has no longer any association with sexual intercourse. It just means it's really hot. Likewise, if somebody says, F, I forgot my homework, it's no insult. It's just meant as an exclamation mark, a sudden shift in topic, usually something unfortunate. So the more a word travels, and I know this is kind of a dense, conversation as I'm trying to condense this article, but as a word travels from its original meaning, and particularly when it starts serving a more grammatical function, like what I've been trying to describe, the more delexicalized it has become. And delexicalization often results in an increase in the use of the word over time because it's expanded its range of contexts, and it can be used in all these other different kinds of ways. That explains why that people nowadays are less offended by the use of the F word and other swear words in general. With the increase in swearing, public views of the use of obscenity have softened, more people finding its use less offensive and even more acceptable. This goes hand in hand with an increase in the use of it by swear words at work and by public figures and political candidates and such. As swear words get put to work in less traditional, literal ways, their negative connotations are less likely to be the first thing that comes to mind when you hear them.
Well, I've also heard the argument that words are amoral, right? Like what's in a word, right? Like that they're not inherently sinful. Like the H word or the F bomb, they're just that. They're just words. And the only time that they're problematic is when they're wielded with hate or, unfounded anger, like you mentioned with the intention of wounding. Obviously, phonetic sounds are not in and of themselves offensive, but surely they're not as neutral as often granted, right?
Interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
The argument you just presented does contain some truth. When you look, and let me tell you how. When you look to the Bible, you won't find anything about there being certain words that are inherently sinful. You won't find it. You won't find it. What is talked about is speech that is destructive or is in itself evil. In other words, the use of the tongue to demean, to hurt, to wound, to defame. Think of the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. He was very clear about this, where he said he equated it with murder. He says, if it says don't murder, but I'm telling you that anyone who's angry with a sister, if you call him idiot, in other words, you go after him with your language, then words kill. I recall someone reflecting on this once. I was reading their comments, and they said that in essence, what is being said is my biting words, my character assassinations, my slander, my innuendo, my gossip, my snide remarks are every bit as revolting to the eyes and heart of God as the dripping knife and the smoking gun. When a parent tells their child that they are stupid or ugly or worthless, a little part of that child dies. When you go on the warpath against another person, becoming active in ruining their reputation or spreading accusations or criticizing their behavior unduly or taking verbal shots, you're taking a gun and emptying its contents out in their direction. Consider it like second-degree murder. I mean, it's an assault with the intent to kill. As it says in the book of James, a word out of your mouth can have so much power. It can destroy almost anything. And he says, my friends, this just can't go on. We just can't use language that way. So it's not using swear words that the Bible targets, but using scarring words. But the Apostle Paul does talk about words a little bit more specifically. Probably the most specific you'll find is in Ephesians, particularly in Ephesians 5, where he says, don't tell obscene stories, don't have foolish talk, don't tell coarse jokes. These are not for people who would follow Christ. And that's obviously true. Using profanity simply to be profane or sexually suggestive or to be coarse or crude has no place in a Christian's life. So while someone may say, well, it's just a word, it's just a sound, that's disingenuous. Words have meaning. Words carry significance in a culture. That's why we use them. They're used for communication. They carry content and meaning, so they are not neutral.
Well, I don't want to leave this conversation without shifting it back to the church for a moment, because within the church context, especially for churches that want to be welcoming to those who do not share the Christian faith, I can see the allure of being a little bit more lenient towards profanity. I remember Driscoll was often touted as, this man's man because of his cussing, among other things too. But he was able to attract people who claimed to appreciate, his authenticity and his relatability. What's interesting is you are the pastor of a church that is composed of people mostly from an unchurched background. And I know you, and I know that your heart is for meeting people exactly where they are. You've even talked about the importance of treating our post-Christian Western world as would, a missionary in an overseas culture, how they would learn the language and observe the dress and the culture and so on. So should learning the language translate into using the language?
To a degree.
Okay.
I think there's a difference, though, between using profanity for profanity's sake and being at times earthy, or using profanity simply as a vulgarism and using some profane words to make a point. For example, anybody who has studied the book of Ezekiel and the words of the prophet Ezekiel, and particularly what the Hebrew meant, as opposed to how so many times we try to sanitize it a little bit in the English translation. Ezekiel was, wow. crazy coarse. He just was. He just was in his language to make his point. The Apostle Paul was as well. I mean, most famously in his letter to the Philippians, where he writes about he's comparing his life as opposed to the infinite value of knowing Christ. And he says, the life I led or whatever I did to validate myself compared to the infinite value of knowing Christ, I just count it all. Most translations say it was just all garbage. Count it all garbage. But the word in the original Greek that was used was stronger than that. It was the Greek word scivola, which was a word for dung or excrement, and a coarse word for dung or excrement, more coarse than saying crap. I once heard a joke that, back then you might have seen a bumper sticker on the back of a cart being pulled by a donkey that says scivola happens. So I do think there is a place for provocative language to make a point. What did Jesus call Herod? Called him a she-fox. That's a female dog. And just, I remember hearing Tony Campolo once give a talk where he said something along the lines of 9 million people die every year of starvation. And he said, and you don't give a shit. And he paused and let that bomb drop. And then he said, and right now, you are more offended that I said shit than you are that 9 million people died. Point was made. The larger question, though, for anyone who follows Christ is whether their speech reflects the Christ life or not. I believe that there are times like Ezekiel or Paul. I'm really not saying that Jesus used the word bitch, but he did call him a she-fox, which is not exactly a positive. But I think there are times like when Ezekiel or Paul, strong language can be used to make a point or to penetrate a resistant spirit, to get their attention, to have an appropriate shock value, to really accentuate something. But having a foul mouth that spews out profanities as a way of just going through life does not reflect a spirit-filled life. The same Paul who used the word scivola was also the one who, in Ephesians, said, don't use foul or abusive or coarse language. In his mind, there was a difference between using coarse language to describe or make a point and using it simply as an obscenity. For my part, I think the most I've ever done is, refer to something that just can hurt like hell. Or I might say, well, that sucks, or something like that. So I'm afraid I'm not much of a cussing pastor. But I don't find that I need to make a point to connect with men or to be blunt and forthright. And I can connect with people in direct ways through language. That can be very direct language. It can be very straight language. It can at times be earthy language. It can be, using words that maybe you don't hear often in church. They're not necessarily obscene or coarse. They're just like not talked about. So you can do it in ways that I think have the same effect. But if I ever did use a word, it would be to join with the sentiment of Paul to try that I felt it was needed to make an emphatic emotional point. And in that case, I would just try to use the best word possible culturally. And it just might be scivola. I don't know.
Well, thank you, Jim, for having this conversation. And thank you, those of you who are listening and who care enough about this podcast and are interested enough about what's going on in your world to get at least get Jim's viewpoint on it. So keep submitting your questions and the things that you'd love for us to talk about. You can do that on the Church and Culture website underneath the podcast link. And we'd love to hear what you'd love us to talk about. But in the meantime, have a great week, and we'll catch you next week.